Hey everybody, welcome back to Will Power Garage. Today, I'm going to show you how to replace the outer and inner axle boot on your 2006 Audi A4 and potentially save you hundreds in replacing that axle shaft. Stay tuned. All right guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, thanks for joining. I ask everyone, please subscribe, drop me a comment below, and give me a big thumbs up if you like these videos. But today, I want to show you guys how to replace the axle boots on a CV axle shaft. I'm mostly going to focus on those steps, how to get the CV joint off of the shaft so you can replace the boots without having to replace the axle shaft. So I'm basically just going to give you guys a quick overview of what you have to remove to get the axle shaft out of the car to then be able to take it apart. There are a couple of universal kits where you can slip the boot over. I'm not going to do that. I never like the way those fit. I try to stay with OEM boots, or at least an OEM style boot if possible and when possible. One other thing I would want to mention, if your axle is making any kind of noise at all, clicking noise, sounds like snapping noises, replacing the boot is not going to fix the axle. That axle is damaged. You're going to have to replace the joint itself. So if you have a joint that's making noise, you don't want to waste your time putting a new boot on. This video is more for someone that maybe was doing another repair, tore the boot, and wants to just replace the boot, or the boot has only recently been torn, or even sometimes what happens is it tears in such a way that the boot still kind of stays closed. So you get a little bit of grease seepage, but not like all the grease is expelled out of the joint. Because once the joint is dry and it's been driven on, you get sand, dirt, water in it, it'll start wearing that joint out really quick. So keep those in mind if you're going to do this sort of repair. So without further ado, I'm going to get the camera set up, and like I said, I'm going to quickly go over what we're going to do to get this axle out, and then I'll get the axle on the bench and I'll show you guys how to take it apart. Okay guys, so as you can see, I'm currently on the passenger side. I have the wheel off right now. This is the reason why I need to repair that axle shaft. As you can see, it's starting to fling grease out. I've got a tear there in the boot. See if I can rotate it a little bit. It's a little hard to see. But there's a tear down there at the bottom. This comes generally with age and stuff like that. I recently did a wheel bearing on this, which is probably why it started leaking. I kind of bent the axle shaft a little bit too much. I'm trying to focus on it. I know it's really hard to see, but you can see the dry rot cracks in that boot itself. So it was only a matter of time before it was going to tear on its own, and I kind of helped it along. So, to get this axle shaft out though, you need to obviously remove the center axle bolt here. Keep in mind, this is also what keeps tension on that wheel bearing. So when we go to replace this, you're really supposed to replace the bolt. A lot of the decent boot kits come with a replacement bolt, because if I remember correctly, this thing is something in the realm of 150 foot-pounds plus 180 degrees. So there's quite a bit of torque on this bolt itself. If we look back in the axle itself, there's, I believe, 6 triple square bolts, so those need to come out. That shield that you see just above it, the heat shield to keep the heat off the boot, you have to remove that as well. And then in order to get enough room to get the axle shaft out, I'm going to have to remove the bolt that is up here. So the bolt that holds the 2 upper control arms. And if I'm lucky, I can get it out without disconnecting the tie rod end here. But chances are I'll probably have to take that off too, just so I can get enough tilt to sneak that axle shaft out of the way. So, like I said, guys, I'm not really going to go into too much more detail on how to remove this. You know, aside from just these basic, this is what you need to do to get it out. You don't have to take the rotor off. You shouldn't have to take off the caliper or anything like that. Just be mindful of the brake hose. You don't want to stretch it out further than you know, it would normally be when it's in the car. So be careful when you're tilting out that bearing carrier to get the axle out. But yeah, I'm basically just going to remove the axle out of this thing, and then I'll get it on the bench and I'll show you guys how we replace that those boots. As you can see, I did have to take the tie rod end off. It just gave me a little bit more room to get this tilted out so I can get the axle out. I did not have to take the heat shield off, so that wasn't bad at all. I did put one of the control arms back in, just the bolt slipped in to hold it there because I didn't want to keep any pressure on the hose or the ABS sensor wire. You can see I pulled it out of the mount there just so I had a little more room out of it. But here's the axle out of the car. So I'm gonna get this on the bench. We'll get it cleaned up, and I'll show you guys the next couple of steps to replace the boots. Okay guys, as you can see, I've got the axle out of the car. I'm gonna start here with the inner axle boot. This is the one that is ripped, so I figured I might as well start from here. You don't have to replace both. You know, if one axle boot is torn and the other one looks fine, you know, you just have to replace the one that's bad. If they both look like they're starting to show signs of age, like this one, you know, it's got cracks in it. You can see where it's tearing here where I ultimately have my leak. You might want to just replace both boots while you have it out. Like I said, the axle's a few $100s. I do like the quality of the factory axle over a lot of the aftermarket axles. That's just me. But a lot of times the CV joints themselves are not bad. You don't have to replace them. So what I like to do first is, I don't need the clamps. The kit comes with brand new clamps for the big and the small. So I just cut the clamps off. And I like to cut them right there in the middle. So, get the other one here. All right, and then what I like to do is I just take a regular utility knife and I cut the old one off. There's no sense in saving it. It's already torn. It just makes it easier to get the boot out of the way, and a little easier to keep the mess down, in my opinion. So I got a cut there. I'm gonna get that boot off. All right. And then from here, you basically just want to wipe up the excess grease. As long as the joint itself was not dry, got dirt or contamination in it, the grease that's in there is still okay. Now the kit does come with grease, but it's usually a small amount. It's just enough really to sort of you know, top off the grease that's in there. But, you know, I like to wipe off, or at least wipe out what I can. And then I will repack this thing with the grease that it comes with. And again, like I said, if your axle joint is making any kind of noise or showing any signs of wear, you want to replace the axle. At the very least, you want to replace the CV joints. You can get these in some locations, you know, and just replace the CV joint itself. All right. So I'm going to clamp this back up here. And then I'm going to grab the camera and show you guys what I'm after. Now that the boot is off and I have some of the grease cleaned off, you can see better what we're dealing with here. Basically what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to hit this axle flange with a hammer and basically just try to get the axle CV joint to come out of the cup. It is going to be a little messy. You can see there's still a decent amount of grease in here, but you know, it's kind of the only way to get this thing off. I want to point out though, there is a retaining clip here. Do not worry about this clip at the moment. It is not what is holding the CV joint in place. What's really holding it up is, you know, they have the top part of the metal here. It's kind of swaged just to make it a little tighter to hold this thing into place. So I'm going to knock this off and then we'll clean everything all up and I'll show you what we need to take off to get the new boot on. All right, as you can see, it didn't really take much to knock that off. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to clean this all up, try to get this grease cleaned up as much as we can. Like I said, you don't have to go crazy cleaning it all up, especially if the joint is in good shape. But what we're after is the retaining clip that is down here. We're going to remove that retaining clip so we can take the spider off. And then we'll remove the upper clip there as well, just so when we slip on the new boot, it'll slip over everything nice. And we're going to try to push it on further than it needs to be, just so we have room to play with it. So I'll probably clean this all up nicely, and then we'll get this new boot on. So let me clean everything up now, and then I'll show you guys how we're going to reassemble this. As you can see, I've got everything cleaned up fairly well. Like I said, I did not go crazy. There was no dirt or contamination in anything. But it's cleaned up. Well, maybe I went a little crazier. I did wire wheel this. I just wanted the sealing surface where the boot goes on to be clean, and I just knocked off whatever rust was still there. But I did end up cleaning out inside of here and a little bit on the CV itself. So now that I have everything off, I've got the inner clip off, the outer clip off, everything's wiped clean. The first thing that needs to go on is not the boot, but the inner clamp. Because if you don't put that on now, it doesn't quite fit very well. So get that guy on first, then you can put your boot on. And that's just so we have room to work when we put the sparta back on and get the cup back in place. So this is the grease it came with. Basically, we're just going to lubricate everything as well as possible. So I'm going to put a little bit where the actual rollers are going to go in here. You know, if you were to replace the axle itself, it's a little less labor, but you know, it does save you money. If you can do it yourself, do it yourself. So first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to put my retaining clip back. You want to be careful. You don't want to overexpand this because you can actually damage it. It'll lose its tension. But I'm going to put that on first so that when I put the spider back, once I have it on, I'm going to use my inner retaining spring. And we're going to put that guy back in place. Again, you don't want to over expand this one. but make sure it goes into the groove that holds it on. And then once you have that all together, you can go pretty nuts with the grease. Again, it is a messy job. It's gonna get everywhere. But you know, that's kind of what you want. You want it to get into all these bearings. You want it to lubricate really well. It needs to be on these bearings. You don't want it sitting down in the boot or in the cup. You want it where it's actually needed here. So, you know, use up all the grease. There's no sense to try to save any for the next job. You know, these always come with Now, before I put that on, I am going to put my other clamp just in place because it's not going to fit over this flange. And then back onto the axle. Go. So just work it around a little bit. Make sure nothing's binding. Everything is still moving around nicely. The boot is actually shaped the same way as the cup itself. So rotate the boot so you have it in the right orientation. Now I've got to get it down a little bit. All right. And you could slip the smaller end off and put it into position where it was in those grooves. And last but not least, what we're going to do is we're going to tighten up the two clamps. Now it doesn't really matter, but it's sort of like an OCD / pet peeve of mine. I usually tighten these two clamps opposite each other. I know it doesn't make any difference. It's just something I do. The other thing I want to point out is there are special tools that are made specifically for tightening up these style clamps. Basically, this pinches the two sides in, and then you can see the middle part where it comes up, and it basically squishes that all back down. This is sort of the same thing. This is just a ratcheting style. Pinches it, and then the inside it's got a part that pushes it up. So you just grab these on the outside, make sure your boot's in the right place, and tighten it down. Let me show you how this one. All right, as you can see, it wasn't very hard to get those clamps on. And like I said, my pet peeve is I like to put the two clamps opposite. But that's basically it for the inner axle. What we're going to do now is almost the same procedure to replace the outer axle boot. We're going to cut the clamps off both sides. I'm going to cut the boot off so I have access. The difference between this one is it has an expanding ring on the end of the shaft that holds the CV joint on. So this one, we're going to hit the actual cup here with a hammer, and it'll knock it off. And then we can clean everything up and put the new boot on. So let me get this set up. We'll cut the clamps and get started. Okay guys, so I have the boot off now. I cleaned up most of the grease because when I smack this, it's gonna make a little bit of a mess. But basically, like I said, at the end of this shaft, there's like a spring ring in there, and that's what's holding the CV joint to the axle shaft itself. So I'm going to take my dead blow hammer, and I'm going to hit this outer cup itself to knock this thing off. You want to be careful. You don't want to drop it on the floor. You don't want to damage the splines here because it'll make getting it in afterwards difficult. And you definitely want to try to avoid hitting the cage itself because you can damage and break that. So, like I said, dead blow hammer, we're going to try knocking this off. And then this is the spring clip that I was talking about here. A lot of the kits will come with a new one. Yeah, let me wipe some of this grease off so you can see it a little better. So a lot of the kits will come with a new spring clip, but that's basically it. That's all that's holding that CV joint onto the end of the shaft. So from here, it's pretty much the same procedure as we did for the inner boot. We're going to clean this all off. We're going to put on our inner clamp, slide the boot over. We're going to put a new retaining ring here. We're going to pack this full of nice new clean grease. And then, with the boot on, we're going to push this back on till this clicks. I've got the CV joint here relatively cleaned up. Like I said, as long as the joint itself wasn't, completely contaminated with dirt, sand, water, you don't need to clean this all the way out. I've had some that were pretty bad, in which case I'll take this in the parts washer or some kind of solvent and I'll clean this thing out till it's dry. If you do that, make sure you move this thing around a lot and you really pack that grease in there. This joint in particular, being on the outside, is moving up and down with the suspension as well as left and right because the wheel has to turn when you make turns. So this joint is actually moving around a lot. This is also the joint which will make the clicking noise most of the time when it starts going bad. So again, if it's making clicking noise, don't even bother with the boot and the grease. It's still going to make noise afterwards and it's going to fail relatively soon. So once you have this cleaned up, just give it a good inspection. Make sure everything is still tight, nothing is damaged, galled. And then, the first thing you want to do is the grease that came in the kit. What I like to do is I like to just kind of pack it in here. And again, this is, it's a really messy job, but just get the grease in as much as you can. Don't worry about the excess coming out. You can wipe everything off afterwards, but just get this grease packed in there, in between all the roller bearings there, as much as you can. Again, you don't have to use it all up and you don't have to save it either. So use as much grease as you need. Just pack this thing really well. All right, so like I said, most of these kits come with the new retaining ring. So I'm going to pull the old one off. Oops, see ya. This is the new ring it came with. Just going to slip this on. Again, it's normal that it's sprung out. You want it to be that way. Inside the CV joint itself has a little bit of a taper, so it'll help squeeze this in when you push that over. So next, remember, put your clamp on first because you won't be able to get it over the boot once the boot is installed. All right, got my boot into place. Usually what I'll do then is I'll put the rest of the open grease tube into the boot. Like I said, I have no reason to save this. And this is the other bag. Again, I want to just make sure everything is really packed well with grease. Again, you can't have too much. In this axle CV joint in particular, where the bolt goes through is also going through into the joint. So what you might see is as I push this out, some of the grease might come out this way. But make sure the CV joint here is even. You don't need to worry about putting this clamp on just yet because it will fit over this, at least this CV joint. But basically what you want to try to do is you want to feel around in there, and you'll feel it go into the splines that are on the shaft. You want to make sure that's on there first, because you don't want to damage those spines. And then just give it a nice whack. And believe me, you'll feel it when it goes past that ring and it is installed all the way. You want to make sure, give it a yank. That way you know it's fully seated past, that ring has gone past the CV joint and expanded out to hold this into place. So from here, I'm just going to wipe up some of the excess grease. Right, part of the reason why we're doing this job is because the axle boot was slinging grease around. So we want to make sure it's not doing that again. Make sure there's no grease in the ABS ring here. You know, if you have anything in the tone ring, it could interfere with the ABS signal, and then you'll have an ABS fault. So just make sure that's nice and clean as well. A little brake clean helps out a lot. Again, you don't have to go crazy. It doesn't have to look perfect. Get my boot clamp on. Of course, this one's going to be a pain in the butt. There we go. The special pliers to squeeze this thing. I prefer these bigger ones to get a little more leverage out of them. Oh. Come on. Thank God for editing. Make sure that's okay. And like I said, I like to put the clamps opposite. Again, it doesn't really matter at all. It's sort of a weird OCD thing when All right, guys, so as you can see, that's basically it for the outer axle boot. So from here, I'm just going to clean this up a little better, make sure all the grease is off, make sure there's nothing in this tone ring itself, and then we're going to reinstall this back into the car. Now that I have my axle rebuilt, there's a couple of things I want to point out here before you go reinstalling the axle. One, you want to make sure that the flange back here on the transmission, all the threads are clean and clear. Because the bolts that go through here, you want to have clean and clear as well. You're going to put some blue Loctite on them. You don't want those to back out. The other thing I want to point out here is, again, I mentioned earlier, but the bolt that goes through here that tightens on the axle is also holding a preload on that bearing. This bolt is going to get torqued down to 150 foot-pounds plus 180 degrees. So you will need someone to sit in this thing with the brake on to get that sort of torque or leverage onto that bolt. So let's get this axle back into place. Okay guys, like I said, last step with installing this axle is you need to torque this bolt down 150 foot-pounds, 200 Newton meters before you actually even put weight down on the car. If you don't do this, you can damage the wheel hub bearing. So first thing first, I'm going to torque this bolt. Try to at least. All right, so now that that is pre-torqued, I'm going to put the wheel back on, and now I'm going to turn this an additional 180 degrees to put the full torque to yield on this bolt. All right, so I've got the car on the ground now. I've got someone in the car holding the brake. It's pre-torqued already. Now I basically just need to turn this 180 degrees, and you can see I mean, I've got quite a bit of leverage here. And this is not very easy to do. And in my experience, I never quite make it the full 180. All right, guys. As always, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. As you can see, replacing the boots on a CV axle are not difficult. The hardest part is probably knowing how the axle comes apart so you can put a new boot on. You know, some of them have retaining clips, some of them have spring clips. It's just knowing how the axle comes apart to be able to do this successfully. The other thing I want to point out is make sure you get a high quality boot. You know, don't skimp on a lot of these universal ones. They don't fit well, the clamps don't hold well. Spend the extra couple of dollars and get a decent boot. But that's basically it. So again, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you subscribe, hit that thumbs up, and drop me a comment below. I'm usually pretty quick with answering comments, at least the stuff that I know. You know, if it's a more elaborate question, just give me a few days. I'll get back to you as soon as I can, all right? But that's it, guys. Again, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.